Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of Harry Potter Theory. In this video, we'll be discussing Harry Potter and his relationship with the Dursleys. Now, it's no secret that Harry and the Dursleys never exactly saw eye to eye, and 99% of the time, I think that you could argue that this toxic relationship is the fault of the Dursleys. However, one consideration that I had was that perhaps the Dursleys were influenced by the long exposure to Harry's Horcrux. I don't think that the Horcrux possesses the ability to completely change them as people, but perhaps it exposes and exaggerates their inner, darker nature. Realistically, the Dursleys were beyond mean to Harry, and were actually quite abusive. He was like their lowly servant, and was punished in unthinkable ways, including locking him in a closet, putting bars on his window, and even preventing him from accessing his own mail. They were terrible. However, they seemed to really love each other, and acted quite civil with other members of society. This makes me wonder, why did Harry incite such rage in them? Why did the Dursleys hate magical folk with such a passion? Rather than celebrate Harry like the rest of the wizarding world, he was trodden on. The truth is that the Dursleys hated any and everything that wasn't normal. Harry's Aunt Petunia was the sister to Harry's mother, Lily, and Petunia's parents always preferred Lily over her, or at least that's the resentful belief that she held. This insane jealousy, of course, stemming from Lily's innate magical ability, something that Petunia did not possess, but secretly longed for. This jealousy started off in a harmless way, and eventually led to her despising anything, anyone, and everything magical. In fact, when she met Vernon, they bonded over normalcy. It was the union of two people who cherished the mundane, consistent, and predictable. When Petunia eventually confessed to Vernon that her sister was a witch, she was unsure of what Vernon would think, but they got past it, and eventually bonded over her very own sister being a freak. So, if she was willing to say such awful things towards her own sister, it's no surprise that she would have very little interest in her offspring. Petunia is really just a very petty person, driven by extreme jealousy. There are plenty of lines in the very first chapter of The Philosopher's Stone that would indicate they are just terrible people. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never even seen him. The boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. We don't know a lot about Harry's relationship with the Dursleys before the Philosopher's Stone takes place, and we don't know how they treated him as a baby. Harry was left on their doorstep at such a young age, and I really can't see how, instead of mistreating him, they wouldn't have just tried to raise him as their own. This was a baby who had no preconceptions about anything at all, and they would have been able to meld this baby into someone just like them if they gave it a chance. They could have at least tried. Fast forward to the Philosopher's Stone, and the Dursleys are up to their usual antics, locking Harry in a cupboard, treating him like a servant, and just generally abusing him. My theory is that Harry's relationship with the Dursleys deteriorated over time, and that it was better towards the beginning. The basis of this theory is that because of their prolonged exposure to a Horcrux, it affected their behavior and the way that they perceived the world. If the Dursleys were as mean as we know them to be right from the beginning, I can't see why they wouldn't have just put him in an orphanage or something. This was the offspring of the sister that she hated. Surely she wouldn't have raised Harry at all if she actually hated him as much as it appears she does later in the book's films. The only thing that comes to mind for why Petunia may have begrudgingly accepted Harry into her home is the fact that Dumbledore left her a letter explaining the unique circumstances for his adoption. In fact, Dumbledore knew that they would need some convincing, which is why he left a letter rationalizing the situation in the first place. Dumbledore's letter to the Dursleys was not particularly extensive or descriptive, but it did highlight a couple of the very important events that had transpired, as well as explain what kind of action he would need from them moving forward. The first thing that Dumbledore explained was that James and Petunia's sister Lily had been tragically murdered. Despite the fact that Petunia had written off Lily from her life, this must have been hard news to swallow, and truly eye-opening with regards to the danger of the wizarding world. Next, Dumbledore explained Lily's loving sacrifice, and the magical protection that would befall on Number 4 Privet Drive after Harry was adopted. This is probably the most important aspect of them taking Harry in, as if they didn't, it could cost him his life. And lastly, Dumbledore explained the dangers of what could potentially happen to both Harry and the Dursley family if Harry were to leave the house before his 17th birthday. when the protection from the loving sacrifice would finally end. It's untelling which part of this letter actually convinced the Dursleys to take Harry in, whether it was the concern for his life or whether it was just them looking out for themselves. Either way, they did end up taking him in, but they didn't exactly do it gracefully. As we know, Horcruxes can seriously affect people's behavior and makes them behave in a much more negative manner. This manner gets progressively worse the more that you are exposed to the Horcrux. We see the same sort of behavior in Ron when he wears Slytherin's locket around his neck in Deathly Hallows. Over time, he becomes moodier and moodier, with each passing minute becoming less and less like himself. So perhaps the Dursleys were affected to a lesser extent, the same way that Ron was affected. However, if Harry's Horcrux makes people angrier, you might argue that it would have had more of an effect on his close friends in the series. My argument for this is that in the Dursley household, Harry would have had the closest proximity to other people for longer periods of time. At Hogwarts, Harry would run around all over the place and had plenty of distance between him and others in his sleeping quarters. Additionally, perhaps the severity of the negative effect that Horcruxes give off is totally dependent on the person that's exposed to it. Maybe some aren't affected at all, while others are crippled by it. The Dursleys are just muggles, so maybe it was just too much for them. Maybe the Horcrux in Harry wasn't enough to affect magical folk. One other thing worth mentioning is that Harry isn't a full-blown Horcrux. When Voldemort tried to kill Harry, the curse rebounded which split Voldemort's soul, but because Voldemort's body was gone, the victim of his own curse, he could no longer encase the soul fragment to complete the Horcrux formation. Part of Horcrux creation involves an encasing spell, which actually puts the soul outside of the body into a physical object. Because Voldemort's soul was left without any attachment, it latched itself to Harry. For this reason, Harry contained Voldemort's soul fragment, but was never possessed by it. Therefore, he did not possess a lot of the main characteristics of a Horcrux. Perhaps the fact that Harry was not a proper Horcrux meant that those around him were affected to a lesser extent than exposure to other Horcruxes. Maybe magical folk were completely fine around him, but it was just too much for muggles to handle. While the Dursleys are just terrible people in general, I like to think that they weren't always quite so bad. Maybe at one point in time, they really did care about Harry, even if only a little bit, and it was just that the Horcrux was too much. What do you guys think? Did Harry make the Dursleys that much meaner, or were they awful to begin with? Let me know in the comment section below. Until next time, it does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live.